Afternoon, everyone. It's just gone 1 o'clock, and many thanks to all of you for joining us for this Chief Scientific Advisor's Office lunchtime seminar on sustainable algal culture in Northern Ireland, current practice and future opportunities. We're delighted to have Dr. Naomi Wilson join us to talk about her work at AFBI, completed as part of a DAERA-directed AFBI Research Work Programme project. Also delighted to have Matt Service and Jay Calvert from AFBI to join the panel for this afternoon, along with Naomi. Naomi's presentation will be around 20 to 25 minutes, which will be followed by some questions and answers. I know Claire Vincent and a number of colleagues have expressed an interest in joining the seminar live, but weren't able to do so because of diary clashes. I think Claire is with the Minister at Rathlin Island today. Fortunately, we're able to offer a playback option via YouTube. A link will be available in a few days' time for you to share with colleagues who haven't been able to join but will have an interest. Before passing to Naomi, I will give a brief introduction. Naomi is based at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Belfast. Her work includes engaging with the NI seaweed industry and bodies involved in the licensing of algae and aquaculture, analysing compositional content of locally grown commercially viable species, developing risk assessment mapping of NI marine environment to provide a guide on optimal location of future seaweed farms in the province, learning as much as possible about integrated trophic aquaculture, and estimating available biomass of key species in NI to assess the value and sustainability of wild harvesting. So, yeah, as I say, Naomi, we're delighted to have you deliver this presentation today, and I'll just pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Hopefully, I'll not hit you too much with sounds that you won't understand, and you can ask questions at the end. Can I just check with the organisers that you can see my presentation?
We can, yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'll start. Okay, so for the past 3 years, I have been working in the FAB branch in AFBI, looking at seaweed aquaculture in Northern Ireland. And it started looking at essentially where the Northern Irish aquaculture industry or seaweed industry is at the moment and what we can do to expand it and scale it up. And I was told that I need to start with explaining what a seaweed is. So seaweed are photosynthetic organisms that you find along the marine environment. They hold on to generally hard substrates with a hold fast to grow, and they look like a sea vegetable. The reason why we are looking into farming seaweed is that seaweed contains many unique compounds that cannot be found in any other biomass. They have compounds which can create that have anti-methanogenic properties, so they can reduce methane in livestock. They can be used for bioplastics, biostimulants, and drought protection for crops. We can eat the food, or sorry, we can eat the seaweed because they have many compounds in it that, like, again, can't be found anywhere else. And there is the ability to use it as a biofuel. So the interest in growing seaweed because of all these unique compounds is expanding the value of the market across the globe. And it has been projected that it will double in value in 7 years from the value from 2021 to 2028. And it is projecting to actually surpass the value that's given here. And the value is mostly based on the growth or the harvesting of what they call macroalgae, and that's the seaweed that you see along the shoreline. It's the more visible seaweed. And from the global production volumes that we see, the European production and the UK production is only a small percentage. Most of seaweed is grown in Asia, in China and Japan. But the growth in the EU seaweed industry and UK seaweed industry is expanding. So for the UK, we're starting to see a lot more seaweed farms growing in England, Wales and Scotland. There's a few more in Ireland, and this will continue to raise the tonnage of harvested biomass from seaweed each year. Surprisingly, Ireland has an incredible seaweed industry that actually surpasses all of the UK. And that is mainly down to the tonnage that is grown from wild harvesting. That's whenever you harvest wild populations of seaweed rather than farming seaweed. And this heavy reliance on wild harvesting is a concern because there is no monitoring or policing of wild harvesters when they go out. So we are actually unsure as to the level of tonnage and to the extent to which this harvesting is going on. And it's not sustainable. When you look at Northern Ireland to compare to the UK and the Republic of Ireland, we're actually not doing too bad in terms of value of the tonnage that we gather. We are doing quite well in terms of the value, and it is because of not only the quality of the seaweed that we're harvesting or growing, but because of the Northern Irish brand that's assigned to to our products. We only have one farm for seaweed in Northern Ireland, and that's based in Rathlin Island. It's called Islander Kelp, and they harvest at the best 50 tons of sugar kelp or wakame each year. The wild harvesters that have kindly given us their tonnage is quite small compared to what is farmed, but they get a very high volume or very high value to their products, and that's based on the value placed on these species that they harvest from the shore. The concern is, as I already mentioned, we don't know how many wild harvesters there are out there. We do know, talking to processors in Ireland, that there are quite a number of wild harvesters out there that are not coming forward with what they harvest. So the volume harvested here could actually be inverted, and there could be more tonnage harvested from wild populations than farmed. And again, this cannot be sustainable for the Northern Irish seaweed industry. It's also, we can't stand by the quality of the seaweed because we're not too sure as to where these harvesters are gathering their seaweed. And with the lack of sustainability, we can't then go into build up the Northern Irish seaweed industry if we can't have guaranteed tonnage per year. And that's why we would suggest going into seaweed farming, where we would have more control of the quality and quantity of the seaweed that we produce. And that is what those who want to buy seaweed would like to have. Sorry. So for increasing demands for seaweed, we need to scale up the harvesting. And so we do need to move from 19th, 20th century harvesting techniques of going out there and harvesting along the shoreline to more mechanized processes as we're now starting to see across Norway, EU and Ireland and Rathlin Island of farming seaweed. And that really brings us to the Sustainable Algae in NI project that DAERA funded in 2023. And some of the main project objectives were to look at the optimal species for farming in Northern Ireland, using the expertise that we have in AFBI to map the Northern Irish shoreline to determine where the most suitable locations would be for siting a seaweed farm, and to assess whether there's public and human implications of using Northern Irish sourced algae. So looking at identifying the optimal species for farming in Northern Ireland, we analysed 96 samples of around 20 species of seaweed across the coastline, looking for bromoform, which is a compound mostly found in red seaweed that can reduce methane production in ruminants by up to 98%. Total phenol, particularly fluorotannin, which is a polyphenol that has a similar property to bromoform. It can reduce methane production whenever it's consumed by ruminants, and fatty acid content. And the reason why we looked at that was whether it would the biomass would be suitable for feeding to the livestock and for feeding to human people, obviously. What we found was that brown seaweeds had the highest polyphenol content and omega-6 to 3 fatty acid content, which shows that it's actually very healthy to eat. And this was found to be higher than the red and green species that we sampled. Looking at the amount that we sampled, Ascophyllum nodosum, which is the egg rack species mostly harvested by in wild populations across Ireland, had the highest polyphenol content across the brown species, followed by Zaccharinha latissima, which is the sugar kelp, and Alaria esculenta, which is wakame, which are the species mostly farmed and the species farmed in Rathlin. So we are recommending that for Northern Ireland farming to focus on the brown seaweed species. So now that we know what can be best farmed, where can we best site these farms along Northern Ireland? And this knowledge that we looked at, we are providing to the DAERA marine licensing so that they can have more knowledgeable assessments whenever applications go in for future seaweed farms. And the risk assessment was based on literature review from risk assessments created in Norway and other areas in the Northern Hemisphere, which already have conducted these types of risk assessments. And I narrowed it down from 32 parameters that had potential impact on site suitability right down to 10. So the 10 most important criteria for site locations of seaweed farms. I also collected data from the 36 sample points that AFBI has from marines along the Northern Irish coastline in order to comply with water regulation surveys. So these are marines that are in the water at all the times and take regular samples of the water. So we have up-to-date nitrate and phosphate concentrations that are there, and we could feed into this map. And I based the risk assessments on farming sugar kelp and Atlantic wakame, which are species that quite a bit of moderate wave exposure. And looking at the Northern Irish coastline, I used a grid square of 5 by 5 kilometres that AFBI has formed for looking at seabed mapping. And from these, I looked at only the nearshore areas, so essentially grid squares that were at the most 5 kilometres from the shoreline. And this brought me down to under 120 squares to look at and to create an overall criteria score. So looking at the key criteria that I use for the risk assessment, from the 10, 6 of these were based on hydrodynamics, so water depth, water temperature, which is important for growing seaweed. We know that temperatures over 16 degrees will actually blanch a Zaccharinha latissima and would be unsuitable then for feeding it or harvesting for the human food market. Maximum wave height, which is important whenever you're considering your infrastructure that is out there. You don't want it damaged whenever the waves are too high. Wave exposure, again, these species like quite a moderate to severe wave exposure to generate to be at their best growth and currents. For nutrients, we looked at nitrate and phosphate, which were provided from the marines that AFBI monitors. Social criteria, I created buffer zones from the sewage outfalls that you don't want to site a seaweed farm too close to a sewage outfall. And for industry, you ideally want to site your farm as close as possible to a harbour or port that you can access and bring your boats and biomass ashore, and onshore algal culture facilities. So processors that we know can take in seaweed biomass from harvesters. And each grid cell was scored 1, 2, or 3 for each of these criteria based on the value that was given for this criteria. And then that score was multiplied by the weighting or the value of that criteria according to its importance for site suitability. And the cumulative value of all these weights were then used to create a RAG colouring system for this map. So 2.4 to 3 was viewed as the most suitable for growing sugar, kelp or wakame. 2 to 2.5 was viewed as amber, and less than 2 was viewed as not suitable, not optimal for seaweed farm siting. Putting it all together, 10 criteria, that's a lot of data. We got data from the CDAR and the SWAN model from Marine Institute, and obviously a lot of data that's already collected from AFBI. And I would just caution everyone for what's about to say. This risk assessment, as I've said, is based on sugar, kelp and wakame. For other species that we wish to be farmed by someone who's applying for a license, each species has different preferences for wave exposure, currents, water temperature, and so the flexibility of this model map means that we can actually adapt this based on the species that the applicant would like to grow and whether the applicant has access to their own resources, they have their own processor site nearby. So we started from a baseline risk assessment where every parameter was given equal weighting. And this is really just to see how Northern Ireland coastline looks for a seaweed farm siting, just the basic level. So we're assuming that the applicant would require access to offshore processors and facilities for the harvested biomass. They're completely new to aquaculture, and we can see there that it's not too, doesn't look too bad for Northern Ireland. Strangford Lough looks quite good, and based on the nutrient levels, it gets a bit red as you go further north. Whenever we change the parameters just to see what else could be done, apologies. The alternative risk assessment, I played around with this to see how it would look if the applicant already has offshore access to facilities, so their own processors and storage facilities for their harvested biomass, and changing the weightings of wave exposure and water temperature, which we know is key to the sugar, kelp and wakame growth and survivability. So we can see that there is a slight change. Strangford Lough gets even greener. So again, Northern Ireland looks good for growing sugar, kelp and wakame. Obviously, as I've said, with caution, we can change the parameter weightings based on the applicant's needs and whether they want to grow a different species. We can also add different parameters. So we are looking at adding aquaculture sites as a parameter to this so that we can create buffer zones around already existing aquaculture sites, because anyone who has a fish farm mightn't want a seaweed farm too close. And we can add this to the risk assessment to see whether it changes the values. In addition, we can add marine traffic. So you don't want to site a seaweed farm where there's heavy traffic and activity. So there is great potential for this map, and it's good to have a baseline and to see the value that this is going to bring not only to the applicants but to DAERA Marine Licensing, who will need to see whether the locations that an applicant proposes to site a farm is actually suitable for what they want to do. So it brings us, sorry.
Let's try about 5 minutes, Naomi.
Thank you. This is my penultimate slide. So can we farm seaweed here for human and animal use? Yes, I think it's possible. There is a lot of interest of farming seaweed here. There's a lot of interest in actually buying seaweed that we can harvest and farm here. I know of a local livestock meal producer who is already actively sourcing people to farm seaweed, and they've already said, if you grow it, we will buy it. So the value of seaweed is known and is out there. So we should be looking into this as something that we should venture into. What we do need to do, though, is estimate the tonnage of sustainable harvested biomass of egg rack in the wild populations. So we need to make sure that those who are out there harvesting egg rack aren't actually damaging our habitat. And we need to continue to develop applying our research to practical seaweed farms. We can do all the research in the world, but if we're not using it for those people who want to do the seaweed farms, it's really quite redundant. And as I did last night, we need to support seaweed farm applications who are focused on sustainable and regenerative farming practices. Last night I did a social license lecture in Glenara for an applicant for a seaweed farm, and it's really to explain to the community what seaweed farming is and the benefits that it can bring to the community. So we need to involve you in helping us bring the science to Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. Just invite our panelists to put their cameras on and come off mute too. And so for attendees, if you post your questions in the chat, and we'll try and get through, or sorry, in the Q&A section, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. Well, thanks, Naomi. You're really interesting and evolving area. I'll maybe ask the first question if that's okay. Can all species of commercial interest be farmed in Northern Ireland?
The egg rack, the Ascophyllum nodosum, the one that's mostly wild harvested in Ireland, at the moment isn't farmed, and there's no interest in looking into whether it can be farmed because it's so abundant along the coastline. However, that doesn't mean that it can be harvested until the end of time. There needs to be more sustainable practices involved. Unfortunately, the processors who buy it don't really ask into how it's being harvested. So there is, like I said, genuine concern that those who are harvesting aren't doing it sustainably. Dulse, which I've shown has a great value in Northern Ireland, has a very variable success rate in being farmed. It's being actively pursued down in County Cork right now, and they've shown some success. Norway, they've given up on farming it because it's quite difficult. But if we actually achieved growing dulse, I think we would be hugely, we would really benefit from it because it is such a high value on the market.
Thank you. Encourage folks to post some questions in the Q&A. I'll maybe ask another one, Naomi, if I can. I think you touched on a couple of areas that I was thinking about as you were presenting, just in terms of the need for regulation, and not just environmental regulation, but I suppose regulation to make sure you've got quality and conformity, and also your point on there's the processing sector will if it's available they will take it. So I suppose I was wondering just if you comment further, maybe just on what you see the potential being from a processor's perspective. From a Northern Ireland perspective, could this be I suppose maybe to try and give a sense of scale as to the potential for this to grow as I suppose a diversification or a new area for Northern Ireland.
Okay. Well, the main processor I know of in Donegal can process about 15 tonnes a day. They pay per wet tonnage, which is about 150 euros. They don't really care too much about the quality of the tonnage because they're literally processing it for a biostimulant, which they then sell on to Mexico. In terms of so the biostimulants, it's quite a low value product because they're literally just looking for wet tonnage to bring it down. If you go into the market, which we're now seeing with nutraceuticals and cosmetics, so tablets that you take for anti-inflammatory reasons or anti-cancer, these are more high value and they require higher processing costs. So the processor wants a higher quality seaweed, and that can't really be guaranteed by harvesting from wild populations. You can't guarantee the quality. It's not, a sustainable quality every year, which brings us to why farming could step in there, because you could more or less guarantee the quality. It's more guaranteed because you're actively sampling every year. You can provide those analysis to the processor so they can stand by your quality. These quality checks aren't really being done with wild harvesting populations unless they're being sold for the human market. So in terms of the value for maybe having a Northern Irish-based processor, I think at the moment, because we have so many small-scale wild harvesters, there's probably not an immediate need for a processor, but with the amount of applications that are going in for seaweed farms, I know of 5 at the moment. That's going to be quite a bit of tonnage, maybe 50 to 250 a year. And they will be looking to generate high quality biomass. So there will be a lot of seaweed to process, and these processors could then stand by the biomass being the biomass, because it would be analysed and they would have certified quality. So yes, I think because Northern Ireland is quite at the beginning of the seaweed industry in comparison to Ireland, Scotland, and the rest of the UK, we have a lot to learn. And we know that in Scotland, they have quite a number of processors. In Ireland, there's at least 6. I think Northern Ireland might need to step up and start maybe with a small processor that could facilitate all these farms that are about to come in to a place, hopefully, if when they get their license approved. And it is like a burgeoning industry.
Thanks, Naomi. I just go to a couple of questions in the chat and encourage others to add. So, first question: your talk focused on risk assessment, but what are the risks you were assessing?
The risk assessment was, I preferred site suitability, to be honest. But risk assessment could be looking at the risk of siting a farm where it's not optimal. So really, starting a seaweed farm is quite a cost. So there is a risk that if you site a farm where it's not going to be ideal for the species that you want to grow, then you're risking your investment. I do like site suitability a bit more, but for risk assessment, it really is based on your resources. So you're risking your resources if you site it in a location where we think it might be best.
Okay. Another question here: are the amino acid profiles for each algae in Northern Ireland available?
Not for every species. There are 650 of them, so that would be quite a lot of work. But we are working on it. I think we've got 20 species that we sampled. Like we said, we've got 96 samples analysed, and yes, we have the fatty acids content broken down and available. This was provided to DAERA, so it is DAERA's property. In terms of analysing every single species everywhere, that's a big venture, something that we would love to do, but I'm not sure whether we'll get the opportunity to do so.
Okay. Just, another question here, just in terms of the site suitability or risk assessment. Did you consider location conflicts, for example, with potential marine protected areas or other activities? So I suppose maybe just a bit more comment in terms of the the factors that would inform those assessments.
Yes, that's the next step for this risk assessment. We know that the Rathlin Islands farm is actually sited in an MCZ, so it can't not be done. But there would obviously be strictures to what they can do in terms of siting a farm in a protected area. what we undertook on the SANI project was to see whether this could be done. So it really was looking at the key criteria for siting a seaweed farm. Adding where protected areas are is the next step, and it's something that I've already started playing with. We can create areas like buffer zones around these protected areas so that the farms are not sited anywhere near them. I have been doing this with one of the seaweed applicants who had a farm location on a seagrass area, and he's actually moved it because he realized where it was. So yes, it's not something that we've ignored. It is something that we're exploring now.
Okay, I have a couple more questions on the chat, but maybe invite Matt or Jay if they want to comment or ask a question.
I think in terms of the risk assessment, I think the best way of looking at it is decision support. And it's probably not. It is initially, of course, aimed at algae culture or seaweed, but it's probably not just relevant to that. It's looking at some of the aquaculture applications as well. So I think it's trying to get the kind of view of advising developers, if you like, where they can do something rather than where they can't do something. So yes, the MPA layers are there, just as the wastewater discharges which are there, and so it's a tool to advise both the regulatory side and the developer side, and into where things can be done rather than sort of constantly playing up in the negatives. I think is the way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think as well on that topic of site suitability, I suppose you also have to remember the scale at which you're analysing these things. So as Naomi says, the coastline is broken into 5 kilometre squared boxes. So these are quite broad scale analyses. If somebody was wanting to cite an aquaculture site, you would need to do a more local scale assessment of the site in terms of the suitability. The wave exposure, for example, it comes from a 0.025 degree wave model. So we're looking at kind of 2.5 to 1.5 kilometre resolution. Where if people are citing a farm, there are likely to be kind of local scale effects that you would want to investigate there. So yeah, I think just it's an important thing to keep in the back of your head. That the tool that's developed here, it's like a broad scale. Is it sensible to do it in this general area? Not, it's going to be 100% successful in this general area. You would still have to do more kind of local scale assessments for suitability, I think.
I think just on some of the other questions, Paul, just in terms of the idea of, I think there's a need probably to look at managing production, maybe on an all, I have to say this very carefully, on an all-island basis to try and match production to producer needs, so that, in a sense, and I don't say this lightly, in a sense, growing seaweed there's a well-documented literature, and colleagues at Queen's Portofari developed a lot of these techniques many years ago. It's mainly a need for perhaps a system for managing the production with the needs of producer and processors, to merge the two, so that the production, which is it's a plant, so it's seasonal, is aligned with the needs of the processors, so the right amount of seaweed is available when it's needed. And that's possibly why we may end up having to manage on an all-island basis, just to make sure that we match what's produced when it's needed by the processors.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, Matt. The seasonality was one of the things I had in the back of my mind to ask about. But
we are looking at ensiling and even freezing some of the products to try, and because, as I say, the problem, you're quite right, the problem is that you can grow huge amounts of biomass in the spring and early summer before the biofouling cuts in, but you might have too much at one time of the year for the processor, so it's trying to match this flow through.
Yeah, turning some of these processes on and off has its embedded costs and complications. So
absolutely.
Yeah. A question here just on I suppose related just to the practical elements of algal culture. What underwater infrastructure is used, and do you rely on natural substrate for, or can an artificial substrate allow growth where suitable natural substrate is absent? So, are these grown on ropes, or what way are they grown, Naomi?
I should have put that slide in there about this. They're grown on ropes. So the beauty of seaweed farms for Northern Ireland is that we've been looking at working with the mussel collectors for seed, so that whenever they're not collecting seed, we can grow the seaweed. It's due to the seasons of seed collection for the mussels and seaweed growth for seaweed farms. So they're grown on a line. There's buoys on other sides. There's a line in the middle, and the seaweed seed is actually twined around the line, and the seaweed actually grows downwards. So that's why I was looking at the surface water parameters. So they usually grow within 3 meters from the surface of the water. They're not grown on the seabed themselves. Anything on the sea, the most things that are on the seabed are like anchors to make sure that the lines aren't being swept away by the currents or like storms. And there's now a movement to look at eco anchors, things that aren't actually bringing like plastic or cement or like something that will be destructive to the seabed, to ensure that the seaweed farm is not moving, but we're not destroying the seabed underneath.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks to Justin, who's posted a helpful picture and a link to where that picture can be found. It's helps visualize just the setup. Another question just from the chat. Could commercial seaweed culture be a diversification opportunity for struggling sea fishing industries?
Yes, this is something that we have seen happening in Denmark, where they've helped fishermen who can no longer fish based on the fish no longer being there, now moving to seaweed. And they are helping them out with like a mussel seed kit and a seaweed kit, and they're going out and helping them set up a little small farm, basically like 1 hectare, and they start small scale, so just like 100-meter line with the seaweed, and with mussel lines as well growing underneath, so that the mussels and the seaweed grow together in this area. And this helps the fishermen continue to work in an environment that they have known and lived with all their life, and they can continue to work there. And they're discovering that this is being really well taken up by coastal communities who can no longer fish. And this is something that whenever we brought people from the aquaculture industry in Northern Ireland to Denmark to see, they got really enthusiastic about, and they are actually interested in growing seaweed alongside their shellfish, because this is seen as now a second harvestable product that they can bring to the market in Northern Ireland and then sell across to the UK and internationally. And we already know that someone who went to Bergen with us, I think made a 2-ton deal with someone in Norway who wanted to buy their product. So the market's out there for products from Northern Ireland that are made from Northern Irish seaweed.
Thanks, Naomi. You mentioned earlier that well, you just in your response to that question, just in terms of potential for diversification, and the potential for the market overall. And there's a question here, and it was something I was thinking on as well. Around climate change and maybe climate resilience, and whether that's included in the assessment. I suppose we are expecting marine heat waves in the future, and whether that's something that is part of the part of I suppose finding suitable sites, or is it just a potential risk for the development of the sector overall?
The risk assessment map is exactly that, a map. If we want to start introducing climate change, we can turn it into a model. We do know that the water temperature around Northern Ireland is increasing, and we have already seen that in changes in the seaweed communities along the coastline. It's something that also DAERA has monitored through their macroalgae community assessments that they undertake each year. And it's something that we in AFBI have been helping the Marine Conservation Society with in their big seaweed search. So we're actively going out there and seeing where the seaweed is growing, and we're using that to monitor the water temperature changes, because seaweed can sometimes be used as a sentinel species. They're not going to grow where it's not suitable for them. And I've already said that at certain temperatures, the seaweed starts blanching and it stops growing. So we can use certain species to actually let us know the changes in the environment. So yes, for seaweed farm siting and using this model, we can adapt it to show future changes in relation to water temperature changes or ocean acidification. Again, we've created something that we can build on. This is literally the foundation. There's so much potential to use it going forward, and it's I think climate change and adapting that into the model would be good. Sorry, Jay.
I think Joyce
No,
should
yeah, I was.
speak about things like changing rainfall patterns with climate changes as well.
Yeah, it's something that we have already. So for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm the ecosystem modeler in AFBI. It's something that we've done several times now with the catchment model. So using the UKCP 18 or CP 8.5 climate projections up to 2080 to look at the effects of change in rainfall patterns and wind speeds, temperature, humidity, and the effect that has on catchments and exports from the catchments to the coast. And then the downstream impact of that on shellfish aquaculture. We're investigating at the minute how we might do that with the marine hydrodynamic models. Using the same UKCP 18 projections to force the marine hydrodynamics. It's just not quite as straightforward because you have to force the marine model with an offshore boundary. It's if you have massive temperature differences between the offshore boundary and the domain of interest that you're looking at, you tend to get blowups. You get mismatches in density and therefore momentum in the model. So it's quite complicated, but we're looking at ways to do that at the minute because it's something it's very important for shellfish aquaculture as well. Temperature is, but that kind of goes back to what I'd said earlier about small local scale effects, like those local warming effects of increased air temperatures. It becomes way more important in the future. If you have a small embayment, it's going to warm up a lot more quickly than somewhere offshore where there's more water exchange. So it kind of like to my mind anyway, it's one of those things. You give a child a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But to my mind, it emphasizes that need, for really robust data collection, continuing into the future, but also an increase in modeling capacity, and model development, so that we have good high resolution model coverage of the whole coast to capture those local warming effects. Yeah, I won't get. I was going to go into more detail, but it's probably a bit too technical. But yeah, it's something that we're actively looking at. As I said, we have looked at it already in the catchments quite successfully using those UKCP 18 datasets. So we're trying to see how we can use those in the offshore system.
Thanks, Jay. And there was a question on environmental risks, and I suppose it's kind of been, both in your answer, Jay, and in Naomi's. It's a, the mapping, I suppose, is the beginning. Once you introduce other factors, and model those, and particularly when you get down to finer resolutions, that there's a lot more that could be gleaned and learned, but. That's maybe a pitch for a further project, Naomi. Is it always good to get that opportunity in here when you get the chance?
in terms of environmental risks, we have found from research and from talking to those who have seaweed farms that seaweed farms can actually act as a benefit to the local biodiversity. They can act as fish nurseries. They can reduce wave attenuation. So some farms are actually being looked at as a nature-based solution for reducing coastal erosion. They can act as like a temporal habitat protection for the fish or crabs along the seabed. We know that seals like to play along seaweed kelp, and terns use the buoys to actually look down on fish. So the seaweed farms are quite often seen as a benefit to the environment rather than a negative. They're also viewed as like a remediation approach method as well, with the sucking up of nutrients and nutrient recycling. They can actually help remove excess nutrients from the water. And I think Matt once shared a paper from 1970 of the use of ulva in the Belfast Loch for bioremediation.
I'm afraid it was the 1930, Naomi.
1930, even better.
I think the concept that we're working a lot with DAERA now is regenerative aquaculture, where we're looking at seaweed culture, shellfish culture, along with the restoration of native oyster beds as to part of the overall picture for improving water quality. I don't think we're not looking at having Chinese style, entire Belfast Loch covered with seaweed rafts, which you would see in Chinese bays. I'm sure you've all seen the images. I think we're looking at much more niche aquaculture alongside mussel ropes and the integration of the restoration of the native oyster to our bays into a much more integrated approach to our systems.
Sorry to cut you off, Matt. Just kind of conscious of time, and we'd like to give folks time to grab a quick bite or a cup of tea before 2 o'clock meeting. So conscious there might be a couple of questions that we can follow up on that I haven't got to. It's just maybe a reflection just of a really interesting talk and discussions and contributions from Jay and Matt. So thank you to Naomi for her presentation, and to Matt and Jay for your contributions. As I mentioned at the outset, there'll be a YouTube video of this presentation available in a few days, and if there are colleagues who weren't able to join and you think would like to hear Naomi's presentation, feel free to share that link on. So thank you all, and good afternoon.
Okay.
Naomi, Matt.